Hello everybody, I'm back and now I'm going to talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. DuBois. And earlier Buckshot was sitting next to me and now Brinkley is here. There's Brinkley and this is Monkey. Hey Monkey. They're all shelter or foundling dogs. They look alike, but they're not related in any way. I just like a fuzzy face. So I tend to get dogs that have fuzzy faces. I also had a bulldog one time, Petey. I love that dog, and that dog loved me. That's the great thing about bulldogs. They just look at you like you're the best thing ever. Anyway, we're not here to talk about dogs. We're here to talk about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. DuBois. So I'm sorry about the noise in the background, and I know you can hear a frog and all that kind of stuff, but I needed the fresh air today, so I'm sitting outside. Okay, let's talk about Booker T. Washington first. I'm looking at my notes over here, so you can find out. I've posted some videos on Canvas, so you can find out all the meat and potatoes with regard to like when they were born and when he died and that kind of stuff. I've also posted in files. If you look in files in Canvas, you'll see a document that basically discusses, sort of compares W.E.B. DuBois and Booker T. Washington. So that's there for you as well. But I just wanted to sort of say a few things, just to, I guess, point out what's important to me with regard to these two men. Both of them are really, really... What, Brinkley, you want to go inside? Excuse me. You can go in if you want to. Here, you can take your ball and go inside. Sorry, he's a little fixated on that ball, but I don't know. Anyway, I guess we all have things we like. So, anyway, Booker T. Washington was born a slave, and then after the Civil War, he and his family moved to what's now known as West Virginia, and that's where his stepfather had a job, and then he worked in a mine, I believe a salt mine, but it was a mining company. Booker T. Washington did when he was very young. And when I say young, I mean like 8, 9 years old kind of thing. So he was able to learn to read and write. He was very charming. He was very personable. He was somewhat handsome. And by, I guess, traditional norms, of what is handsome. I don't like to say that somebody's handsome and somebody's not handsome, because it's all in the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I have discovered. And so, but he was very, very charismatic. And so, and he knew that he wanted an education. And so, he went to the Hampton School in Virginia. And so to get there, it was 400 to 500 miles away. He basically walked. He probably got some rides along the way via mule, that kind of thing, or horse and buggy or whatever. But basically, he had to make sure that he got there himself. And so it would be like deciding that you wanted to go to school somewhere in Miami and you left Tallahassee and walked to Miami. He did not make that trek back and forth. Like, he didn't go back and forth. He just decided that's where he was, he could go to school there, and then he had to get there. And so the only way he could get there, the only transportation he had, was by walking. So he got there. And when he got there, he started attending school. He took various jobs there. He was a custodian. He worked there for a while. And then he went back home. And then he came back to the school after a few years and was a teacher there. Hampton was a school for African American people and also for Native American Indian people. And so he went back as a teacher. So he was teaching there when Alabama decided that they wanted to build a school and this was part of the historic black college kind of thing, and they wanted to build Tuskegee Institute. So he was able to get some money through the people, that he had worked with, and he was the kind of person that he didn't really mind going in the back door if he came out the front door with a check, right? So he put the idea of education and making sure that African Americans got an education above any other political ideas for advancement. He thought that if he could get the school going, if African Americans could get an education and could start making money, their own money, then they would address the ideas of political inequality. So he was really pushing the idea of a more vocational school, and that's sort of what was happening at Tuskegee. Some people, for example, W.E.B. DuBois, who was not born into slavery, he was a few years younger than Booker T. Washington, but he was born in Massachusetts, and Great Barrington, Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, my husband is from Housatonic, Massachusetts, and it would be like the distance between Tallahassee and Quincy, or Tallahassee and Havana. It's very close together, so I've been to that area quite a bit. And when he grew up, he was in an integrated school. His family was well thought of. He lived with his mother and his mother's family. They had land and had land there, so they were a very secure family. And he, was like valedictorian of his school, and he never dealt with racism until he came to go to school at Fisk University in Tennessee, and that was the first time that he had ever dealt with that he had really been faced with racism. And so it was rather shocking to him after, growing up as, in a place that was not segregated, and was not, he wasn't thought of as anything less than, or he was who he was, and he was very secure in that. And so unlike people who grew up in the South, and because of the attitudes, were often made to feel that they, being a person of color, were less than a white person or a Caucasian person. And so there's that he didn't deal with as a child, like Booker T. Washington did. So Booker T. Washington really thought about, and so he had a book called Up From Slavery, and he basically said that he wrote that book in order to get money for his school. And he wrote it in such a way as to not offend people of power who might be able to contribute to the school. So he wanted them to be sympathetic to his plight, to the plight of other African Americans. So he was very upfront in talking about that. So his most famous speech is the one that he made at the Atlanta Exposition. And that's where he talks about that, the Great Migration is happening now, and lots of African Americans are moving out of the South, and they're going in droves to get away from Southern hostility. And so he's trying to get African Americans, to stay in the South. And so he's saying, cast your bucket down where you can here, and then you'll be able, this place, these people, you've worked with these people, you can still work with whites or Caucasians, Caucasians, you can still work with African Americans, with, I think his term was Negro, and you can still work together. You don't have to run away to get work. And then he said, you can, in all things all things professional, you can be like the hands working together, but also in things social, you can be like the fingers and be separate. So I'm sort of, I don't know the exact quote, but basically he was saying that if you could work together and make the South better, but you still don't have to hang out with each other. So in that sort of sounds a bit like separate but equal, and embracing the idea that politically it was okay at this time for things to be separate. W.E.B. DuBois said, no, that this is not going to work at all. For African Americans to succeed, they need to get a liberal education, liberal arts education. They need to go and they need to get their master's and their PhD, and they need to work as doctors and lawyers, and they need to understand philosophy, and they need to do all this stuff in order to really make the change that is necessary. And so W.E.B. Du Bois really disagreed with Booker T. Washington on this. He said, do not waste your time getting a job for now so that you can have money. Instead, move forward and do the best you can. Be part of the talented 10th. Be that one person that leads African Americans to where they need to go. So that's the idea behind W.E.B. Du Bois. His sort of the book that he's most famous for, time for a juice break. Thank you. And I know it's rude to drink in front of somebody without offering it to you. Can't do it. Anyway, I won't edit that out too because I'm not very good at editing. So Booker T. Washington, so W.E.B. Du Bois, his most famous book, I guess, he's written a lot of books. He also wrote poetry. But his most famous book is The Souls of Black Folk. And it was written after he did, he was sort of like he's a sociologist. And he studied African Americans and sort of what transpired in order to make African Americans living under the racism that they lived under, and sort of what they had to do in order to survive. And this came along with the idea of double consciousness, and how African Americans have to they're always thinking about themselves as in a duality. And so the idea of, I guess, what do we call it? I guess we call it code switching now. But he called it the double consciousness, and ways in which African Americans had to sort of put on this face for this person and then this face for this person, and in order to survive, and what that did to the psyche of the person. Jamila Lyscott talks about it currently. She's a woman who's a teacher. She has her PhD. Her parents are from a Caribbean island. She grew up, I believe, in Harlem, and so she talks about how she has a way that she talks with her parents, and she has a way that she talks with her peers at work, and she has a way that she talks with her students, and she has a way that she talks with her friends that she hangs out with. And so in doing this, she switches back and forth depending on who she's talking to, and wonders, why does it mean that one is necessarily better than the other? The way society has often said that, you have to speak a certain way. And W.E.B. Du Bois was one of those people that said that African Americans should strive to speak the Queen's English, that they should not rely on dialect, they should not rely on vernacular, and that they should dress the best they can, that they needed to appear to be at the top of their game. And so that's often sort of said today, that African Americans or people of color, have to work twice as hard and appear, to be twice as good at a minimal in order to be accepted in, a Eurocentric society. And so these are things that he's talking about in, 1903, 1913, and that's sort of amazing that, that he is talking about these things then, and he talked about them his entire life. He was also instrumental in starting the NAACP, and he also was instrumental in the Harlem Renaissance. He, in the 50s, was branded a communist. And really, he was like, no, I'm really more of a socialist. The idea of, so some of the things, I think he called himself a socialist democrat or a democratic socialist or whatever, basically saying that, you know, we have so many people who have tons and tons of money, and then we have so many people that have nothing, and why can't we sort of distribute that? And that did not go over well in capitalist United States in the 1950s. And so people were calling him a communist and that kind of stuff. And he was a Pan-Africanist, and really believed that if all people of color banded together, that they could really establish trends and change society. He died, I think, one day prior to Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in Washington, and so he lived, I mean, from the late 1800s through, what is that, like 1963. And so it is really, really interesting to think about the changes, because Booker T. Washington thought that, separate but equal would be okay. And he actually died in 1915. So he didn't really live to see how separate but equal was never equal, and how it did not work. Whereas W.E.B. DuBois saw all of that and was able to really figure those things out. So he, at the end of his life, he lived in Ghana. He is still very well known and very, very well admired. So that's just sort of like a little synopsis of information about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. If you have questions, be sure to post them. And I look forward to talking to you next about the Harlem Renaissance. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Bye.